So, today I am very excited because I am talking more in depth about one of my favorite topics, which is how to sound more professional in English. Last week, I kind of gave a general overview of some of the things you should keep in mind in order to sound more professional in English. And today I'm going to be talking about one of my absolute favorite topics, which is how to use your voice and your breath in order to sound more professional in English. The thing I want to emphasize before we even get started today is that it is not about having perfect pronunciation. So many of my students and so many of my clients get a little overwhelmed trying to think about how they can improve their pronunciation in order to speak perfect English. And the thing is, accent is part of your character. It's what gives your voice a little more character. And so your pronunciation will definitely improve the more you speak English, the more you work on it. But the goal is not always the perfection because the goal is actually to really increase and improve the way you communicate with other people. And the good news is that by using your voice and your breath a little more deliberately when speaking English, you're going to be able to sound more professional and you don't even have to worry about your accent. To be perfectly honest, accents are not that strange for most native English speakers. Why? Because we live in a global society. In the United States, there are lots of immigrants, there's lots of tourists, there's lots of people whose family members are from other countries. So even though someone like me, I don't have an accent, I interact with people with accents all the time. I used to live in New York City, I used to live in San Diego, I know, and I live in Boston, and all of those cities have a lot of international students, have a lot of people who have moved and immigrated to the United States. So we're used to hearing accents. The goal is not eliminating your accent. But since we're specifically, whoops, got a little blurry there. Since we're since we're specifically talking about how to sound more professional in English, I really want to talk about how you can use your voice in order to express yourself a little bit better when speaking English and when speaking English with colleagues and coworkers and also in academic discussions and settings. So today I'm going to talk basically in more depth about 7 different ways you can use your voice and breath to sound more professional English. A lot of these skills are things that you've studied before in different ways, or maybe you've thought about, or maybe you think about in your native language. But we're really going to talk about why focusing on each aspect of using your voice and breath in these ways will help you sound more professional. And I'm going to talk about what it really does in order to help you communicate your ideas a little more clearly, make sure your listener is really listening to you, and just making sure that your message remains clear when you're speaking. So, when we're talking about sounding more professional, we're talking about giving presentations, leading discussions, interacting in meetings. So, each of these skills will be used slightly differently depending on the context. So, a lot of these skills are especially for giving presentations or speaking at a little more length with your coworker. Some of the other sound more professional lessons I'll be doing later this month will focus on things that you can use in order to interact one-on-one with people or in a group setting. But these skills are useful everywhere, but they'll be especially useful when you have to lead a meeting, lead a presentation, or speak at length in front of other people. I know that's a big challenge for a lot of non-native speakers. So I'm going to take a look right now at my presentation. And so if you notice me as I go through the lesson looking down, it's just because I have notes and I want to make sure it's so important to me that I want to make sure that I can share all of these skills with you. So, um, I do think that it's important to mention that even though speaking with perfect pronunciation is not the goal of sounding more professional, you want to really consider that your main goal is to use your breath and your voice in order to emphasize your speech. So it's not about presentation, but it is about learning how to use stress, how to breathe, and how to use your voice to really emphasize what you want to say. Native English speakers don't think about this. They don't really consider that they're doing this because they follow the natural rhythm of English. We're used to expressing ourselves and using our voice in these ways, but every language is different. Some languages you wouldn't use stress in quite the way that we use it. You don't use intonation the way that we use it. Intonation has a different use, and you might not breathe in exactly the same way, right? There's some languages that when you hear them, especially if you don't speak them, it sounds like no one's breathing ever, right? Because they're just speaking really quickly. And so that's why I want to show you how to use your breath and how to use your voice the way native English speakers do. The other thing to mention is that when you have this very clear voice, if you think about a truly great speaker or an orator, that's someone who speaks really, really well, they really understand how to pause for emphasis, slow down to let a point sink in. They highlight their key points with word stress, and they use their intonation and volume to engage their audience and to make what they're saying more relatable. So you don't need perfect pronunciation to be an effective speaker, but you do need these 7 skills. So just to show you all of them from the beginning, they are breathing, slowing down, pausing, punctuating with your voice, using stress and emphasis, intonation, and increasing and decreasing in volume. So I'm going to talk about each of these in a little more depth. So let's talk about breathing in your breath. I laughed in last week's lesson because it seems like a kind of strange skill to mention, right? Why is breathing part of sounding more professional in English? Well, what happens if you're a non-native speaker is you tend to get pretty nervous when you're giving especially giving a presentation, leading a meeting, when you're in charge and everyone's paying attention to you. So if you have a job interview or, even if you have to speak in front of an audience or a discussion seminar. So what you want to do is really think about the fact that you need to breathe, right? You need to take some time to fill your lungs with air and give yourself a chance to breathe in order to not overwhelm yourself. When you stop breathing, when you breathe or you breathe very, very shallowly, very, very, very little bit of breathing, you end up speaking more quickly. I do this too. I am a very, very fast speaker. You probably know this. So I have to remember, breathe. That will help give me a chance to really consider what I'm saying. The thing that happens when you are speaking without breathing well, you sound like all of your words are connecting together, right? There's no very clear distinction between one idea and the next idea. And what can happen if you're not breathing the way a native English speaker would, this can emphasize your pronunciation challenges. It can make it sound like you're not very careful when you express your thoughts. So I really, really, really want you to breathe. I want you to think about how much you're breathing when you're speaking. This, I actually was meeting with one of my clients the other day, and he said, you breathe differently than me when I'm speaking. I don't breathe in the same places. And so we'll talk a little bit about how the breath can kind of frame your ideas in just a moment. But you do want to think about, where do native English speakers breathe? You can even watch when someone's giving a presentation. I always suggest watching TED Talks because they're short and easy to understand. Think about where they breathe. Think about where they pause. There are breathing. You might not notice because you're listening so carefully to what they're saying, but the breath is really important for giving them time to complete their ideas. The other thing I do say about breathing is that even you might feel uncomfortable taking time to breathe because you feel like you're not expressing your ideas. You feel like, I need to speak really fast so that people can follow me. But breathing gives you a chance to think about your thoughts, to collect or gather your thoughts if you've gotten distracted or gotten off topic. And that way, if you breathe, instead of using a filler word like I mean, like, which I use a lot, if you give yourself a chance to breathe, you don't need to use those filler words. So that's something I try to pay attention to as well. How can I breathe and just pause instead of just continuing on or filling in between my words with one of those words like that's distracting. So breathing is a good way to substitute. You can substitute your breath for filling in with one of those words, especially if you have a tendency to fill in with a word from your native language that isn't that common in English. Breathing is also important, as I mentioned, when we're talking about phrasing when you're giving presentations. So, phrasing is breaking sentences into manageable chunks. So, you need to breathe in order to emphasize certain ideas. It's only when you pause and give yourself time to breathe that the point really stays there, right? Really hangs in the air, really stays for people to listen to, and it becomes clear to your listener. If you don't breathe after your main point, especially your main point, the person is just following your thought as you continue on to something else. And they're not following the fact that you're expressing your ideas, right? They're not listening to what's the main point because you haven't pointed it out to them. If you want your listener to listen to your main point, you need to use your breath, you need to use pause, and you need to use your volume, you need to use stress, and you need to use and intonation in order to show what that main point is. So, breath is one of the first and most easy ways you can let the listener know what's the most important thing you want them to understand. So, let's talk a little bit about phrasing with I have an example sentence here, right? The most important thing that we need to do to succeed is to pay attention to the way we are helping others. So, as I'm saying that sentence, by pausing at the end of each phrase, by just using that breath, breathing, giving the people a chance to listen, I'm emphasizing my key point of that sentence. And this is just a sample sentence I created just to have it ready. The most important thing that we do to succeed is to pay attention to the way we are helping others. Imagine if I said it more quickly at my normal speed. The most important thing that we do to succeed is to pay attention to the way we are helping others. My point is not as clear, it's not as dramatic, and it's not as emphatic. So, as we talk about the other skills, you'll see that I can still use stress to emphasize my main points. But by using stress with breathing, by using stress with pausing, I'm really going to be able to clarify what I mean to my listener. I hope that makes sense. So the next thing, so number one, breathing. Think about your breathing a little bit more when you're speaking. Think about how you can give yourself time to think, not use filler words, and then think about how breathing can also really help you emphasize different parts of your sentence. And we'll talk more about it when I talk about pausing. So, tip number two is to slow down. Focusing on your breathing encourages you to slow down. So many non-native speakers think that you need to impress with how quickly you speak. I talked about this last week when I talked about when I learned Spanish and I was living in Argentina. Somebody warned me that by focusing on your speed and how quickly you can express your ideas and how fast you speak, a lot of times we think the faster I speak, the more fluent I am. This is not true. When you speak fast, you're not giving yourself time to really consider what you're thinking. You're not paying attention to aspects of your pronunciation, your stress, and your intonation. And you're just basically rushing to get to your point. So you might sound great, wow, you speak really fast. But if you really slow down, and you give yourself a chance to fully form the words the way they need to be formed, fully express the stress by increasing the length of the vowel, by raising the volume of your voice. All of these things help you sound more intelligible. And by more intelligible, I mean that you're able to be more clearly understood by your listener. So you really do want to slow down. Slowing down will really help your point be more clear to your listener. So if you slow down, you give yourself enough time to lengthen your vowels, give your voice a chance to rise and fall, and you can also express your emotions and attitudes through intonation. The other thing about slowing down, the same as what I said about breathing, is that slowing down can give you time to focus on what it is you really want to say. So you can fully express your thoughts, right? It's all about fullness. Slowing down gives you time to fully express your thoughts, fully pronounce your words, fully emphasize and stress the most important parts of the sentence, right? This is so important. Slow down. Also, slowing down has a benefit for your listener, right? Slowing down enables your listener to think about what you said. So, I mentioned earlier that most native speakers are familiar with people with an accent, but sometimes people hear an accent. I noticed this a lot when I was speaking Spanish. If people are not used to hearing accents, they take a moment and they think, oh, I don't think I understand this person. Not because you're not clear and you're not clearly speaking. It's just because they need time to process, oh, okay, yes, I do understand what they're thinking. So by slowing down what you're speaking with more confidence, you're speaking more deliberately, and it gives them a chance to process and consider what you're thinking. They also pay more attention. When someone speaks really fast, and I have this problem too, a lot of times it's easy to tune out what they're saying, right? You just stop listening to what they're saying at all. And that's not your goal. You want to slow down so that people are more likely to consider what it is that you're saying. So that's tip number 2. Make sure you consider slowing down. Breathing will help you slow down. Slowing down will help you give you more time to pronounce your words, express your ideas, and give your listener a chance to think about it. So, next, after slowing down, we come to pausing. So, I mentioned pausing a little bit with breathing because they're connected. So, the most important thing to emphasize about pausing is that you need to pause at the end of the sentence, right? Think about when you're reading, right? When you're reading, you come to the period at the end of the sentence and you know to just pause. The idea has completed. Well, when you're speaking, you also want to create this pause with your voice. You want to end the sentence at the end by pausing and taking a deeper breath than you would in the middle of the sentence. We also pause mid sentence. We pause at the commas, right? So if you read a very long sentence, you're going to mentally pause when reading at the commas, but you also want to create that pause after the commas when you're speaking. I did that in the example where I demonstrated a little bit about phrasing. I'm also pausing after the main ideas because pausing at the end of these really important key ideas is like hanging it in the air. It leaves it hanging so that the person is really considering, what did he just say? Clearly, it's important because he paused. Pausing is a really important thing to keep you breathing and slowing down. And pausing also, like I said before, gives the people time to digest and consider what you're saying. The other thing to remember is that you might be super smart and you might be able to speak at this super high speed, but the person listening to you may not process at quite that speed. Think about if you haven't had your coffee yet in the morning or haven't had enough caffeine or you didn't sleep well. Sometimes you need a little more time to process and to think about what it is you say. So if you want your listener to understand you, pause. Give them a chance to digest what it is that you said. The other thing that's important to mention about pausing is because it does emphasize the key point of the sentence, it's a good way if you feel like your listener isn't there, they're not paying attention, they're not listening to you. You want to pause and then be able to give them a chance to kind of, oh, they paused. Did I miss something? It wakes somebody up without having to be like, Joe, are you paying attention? Can you please come back to the meeting? You can just pause at the end of the sentence. And especially if you lengthen the pause a little bit longer, everyone's going to be like, oh, what is it that I missed? Oh, I'm paying attention now. So it's a really easy way to bring people back to what you're saying without having to stress out about calling people out and mentioning who's not paying the most attention. Okay. So I'm just checking real quick. Oh, hi. Hi, Ranjit. Nice to see you. I will answer any questions afterwards if you have any questions. So please leave a comment in the live chat. I'm about halfway through, so that's why I wanted to check to see if anyone had any questions. So now I mentioned pausing as a good way to emphasize different points of the sentence. And another way to think about using your breath, your pausing, and is to also think about it as punctuating with your voice. So remember, punctuation is the periods, the commas, semicolons. They're ways that we connect different ideas and kind of connect different clauses. I'm not going to get into grammar right now. But so when you want to punctuate with your voice, what I'm really talking about is ending the sentences, connecting the sentences by using your voice there. So pausing is just one way to do it. Other ways that you can punctuate with your voice are to use stress and intonation um, more clearly. But really, just to reemphasize punctuating with your voice, I'm talking about doing that rise and the fall at the end and also pausing, right? So it's connecting those two things. It's connecting stress and intonation, and it's connecting pausing in order to come to the end and then finish your sentence. I paused right there. I have to remember to follow my own suggestions. So you want to come to the end of the sentence, pause, right? That's punctuating with your voice because when you're reading, your eyes, your brain naturally do that. But when you're speaking, you need to do that, especially if you're leading some sort of presentation for somebody or leading a discussion. They're expecting you to lead them with your voice. So, moving on from punctuating with your voice through pausing and also stress and intonation, what I want to talk about is stress and intonation, right? So, especially stress can be so effective in order to convey your ideas, emphasize your points, and make sure that your listener is following. As I mentioned at the beginning, we have a natural rhythm of English. I'm not going to get into great details about the rhythm of stress and how stress works because that's too much for this video. I want to keep it fairly short. But stress is key to creating that rhythm of English. And the way that stress works is that stress is the you will stress or emphasize the key words of your sentence. And these are what we call the content words. So they're the nouns, the verbs, the adverbs, the adjectives, the words that are really conveying the most important parts of your message. And by stress, we're making them longer, louder, and higher in pitch. So this is creating the rhythm of English. And this is also creating like the more engaging way of expressing yourself, a way to really get the person listening to what you want them to understand and what you want them to hear when you're speaking. So even if your pronunciation isn't perfect, the rhythm and the music of your speech will keep them paying attention because they're going to be following your words, right? They're going to be following, oh, okay, I understand that word and that word. This is what's important, what somebody's saying. We also use stress to emphasize the most important words of the sentence, especially when it's not the word that we're expecting. So these are what we call focus words. If you want your listener to pay attention to certain aspects of your sentence, you're going to make those even longer, louder, and higher in pitch. That's how you make your voice more dramatic. I'm being a little dramatic in this video right now because I really want you to understand how we can use our voices to engage our audiences. Teachers naturally do this, right? If you have a boring teacher who you're not interested in, they probably sound like a robot with no stress and no rhythm, right? I don't think you understood that. But someone who's a little boring doesn't have that variety in their voice. Someone who's more interesting is going to have longer words, is going to have louder words, going to have higher in pitch. And that's what keeps you engaged in what they're saying. So that's how you can use your voice to be more dramatic. I highly suggest watching TED Talks, watching comedians, give funny speeches. You can watch people give official speeches in front of big audiences. They use their voice in order to be more dramatic. It's also a great idea to watch movies, to think about that really the best scene in a movie and watch it in English and think about, oh, they're using their voice to really make me listen to what they have to say. It doesn't have to be in a presentation that you use your voice to be really clear. I'm thinking of a movie which is a romantic comedy, and there's this key moment where the two characters interact, and the way that she speaks to him really makes him understand how she feels because she's using her stress. She's using that emphasis in her voice. So it's really important to think about stress. I mentioned when you slow down and when you breathe, you're giving yourself more time. So remember, stress is longer, right? A lot of non-native speakers want to speed up and all the syllables are the same. No, in English, stress has longer syllables, and that's where they're longer, louder, higher in pitch. So if you're slowing down, you're connecting all of these concepts, you're going to give yourself a chance to fully express that sound, which will keep your listener very engaged. Of course, intonation is very important. I am going to link below this video to my other video lesson on how you can use intonation for conversational purposes because it's too long to talk about today. But you want to consider your intonation when you're speaking. If you're asking your audience a question, you want to use question intonation. It's a very good way to engage your audience in what you're saying or engage your listener, right? You can ask questions in order to get them to respond to you or to just consider what it is you're going to answer. If you're giving a presentation, a very common technique is to ask a question and then answer it yourself. But when you ask the question with question intonation, your listener has a chance to think about it. They have a chance to think about what you're saying. The other thing, about yeah, if you even if you don't want them to respond, they have a chance to reflect and think about what you're saying. If you're finishing a sentence and you notice I do this in so many of my sentences, intonation's key. If it's a comma, your voice is still gonna be up, telling your listener that you're not finished. That's how we use intonation to show the person, "I'm not done talking yet. Still listen to me," right? So they know not to interrupt. But if you're finished or you finished a point, your voice is going to rise and then fall on the last keyword of that sentence. So you want to signal to your listener that you're done talking or that you're done that sentence or that you're done, that really key point. You can use intonation to be really clear about what you're saying. And again, that's what I mean when I say punctuating with your voice. It's pausing at the end, it's stressing the last important word of the sentence, and it's using intonation to rise and fall. It's all connected. It's always connected. The other thing about intonation is it just makes what you're saying more interesting. If you're expressing surprise or doubt, or you want to carry your listener along with the attitude you have in your speech, you're going to use intonation to do that. That's why it's not just about stress, it's also about how we rise and fall with our voice, which leads to my last and final point, which is increasing and decreasing in volume. So, another technique that you can use that's connected to stress and intonation is to think about the volume you are speaking at. You want to use a volume that's appropriate for your setting. So, if you're in a small room, you don't want to scream at the top of your voice. You might want to whisper. You might want to engage the listener by talking at a low, low volume because they're going to be wondering, why are you talking in a whisper? And they'll pay more attention to you. Do you need to project your voice? Is it a big room and you don't have a microphone? I have a microphone, so you can hear me more clearly. You can project your voice, right? Make it louder. Do you feel like people aren't listening to you? You might want to make your voice louder in order to get their attention. So you can increase and decrease in the volume of your voice based on your setting, right? Think about how you need to use the room that you're in or use the microphone if you have a microphone in order to express your ideas by rising and falling. Um, the other thing to keep in mind is that your volume variations can also keep the listener really engaged, or you can use it for effect, right? You can whisper something that's kind of a secret or something new, or you can raise your voice if you're so excited. And by using the volume, you're actually showing power with your voice. If you can believe it, this can actually help you control your audience, control your listener. So if you're kind of changing the volume of your voice, they're more intrigued. If you're booming your voice and really emphasizing things, they know you're making a really important point. So using your volume in a way that's connected with stress and intonation, but also you can just vary your volume for effect. And I talked about on my lesson last week about how you want to be more engaging and more relatable. So, using different aspects of your volume, using your voice for effect, these are things that can make the person more interested in what you have to say. So, instead of them paying attention to whether your pronunciation is correct, you don't really have to care about that. You're using your volume, using stress and intonation in order to make what you're saying more interesting and more engaging. So, that is my lesson for today on how to use your voice and breath to sound more professional in English. So, just to remind you, what we talked about today was breathing. Number one was breathing, right? Using your breath in order to give yourself time to fully express your ideas and also slow yourself down and get a little less nervous, right? To feel a little more confident. When someone breathes more confidently when they're speaking, they sound more confident. The number 2 is to slow down, right? Slowing down is connected with breathing, and slowing down really gives you a chance to fully express your ideas, fully express your pronunciation with pronunciation, get the full sounds out of your mouth, gives your mouth a time to form the sounds, and it also allows you to use stress and intonation by fully expressing those longer vowel sounds, the stressed syllables. Connected to those two is pausing, right? We pause in order to emphasize key points of our sentence and in order to make sure that our audience is listening. Connected to that is punctuating with your voice, right? We use pauses in order to signal that an idea is complete, and we also use pauses in order to um, do things for emphasis, to use stress and emphasis in order to get the person listening. Of course, stress and emphasis is key to having the rhythm of English and sounding more professional with the way that you're speaking, right? Because that rhythm is expected and people are wanting to follow your main ideas through your stress, even if they don't know why. So, stress and emphasis also is a way to punctuate with your voice, connected with pausing and connected with intonation. It shows the listener what you're trying to express and what's most important. Connected to that is intonation. Intonation is key to showing the person your feelings and attitude and also getting them more engaged in what you're saying, right? So that they're not just hearing a robot speak, they're hearing someone who's expressing key emotions in the way that they're speaking. And last but not least, I talked about increasing and decreasing in volume in order to make your speech more engaging, in order to use your voice for control and power, and also for effect, right? For a dramatic effect, but also to make the points that are most important very clear to your listeners, similar to punctuating with your voice. So, those are 7 ways you can use your voice and breath to sound more professional in English. Once again, I am Kim from EnglishWithKim.com. I'm your guide to the essential conversation skills you need to sound more natural in English. If you are really interested in sounding more natural when you speak English, please be sure to sign up for my free email course at soundmorenatural.com. You'll be able to enter your email and join my free email course and get those updates from me when I'm sharing these videos and sharing other lessons that can help you improve your English. So, thank you so much for watching this live video, and I will talk to you very soon. Goodbye.